We thought we'd found our slice of the American dream, building a deck that was perfect in every way. But our new neighbor saw an opportunity to tear us down, weaponizing every city rule she could find, completely unaware she was messing with the chief building inspector. The scent of freshly cut cedar wood was my idea of heaven. It was a Saturday morning, the sun was warm but not scorching, and I was finally making real progress on the deck I'd been dreaming of since we bought the house. My wife, Sarah, brought me a tall glass of iced tea, her smile as bright as the morning itself. Our 7-year-old daughter, Maya, was helping by sorting screws into little piles on a tarp nearby, humming a tune from her favorite cartoon. This was it. This was the life I had worked so hard for. We'd saved for years to move into this neighborhood, a quiet, leafy suburb with good schools and houses that weren't stacked on top of each other. It was the American dream, or at least my version of it. For the first month, everything was perfect. Neighbors brought over pies and casseroles. We got friendly waves on our morning walks. It felt like we'd found our forever home. Then, Carol moved in next door. Or rather, she hadn't moved in. She'd just been on a month-long cruise. Her return was announced by the sudden, unnerving feeling of being constantly watched. I'd be watering the hydrangeas, and I'd catch a flicker of movement behind her pristine white blinds. I'd be grilling on the patio, and I'd see the glint of what looked suspiciously like binoculars. Our first official interaction was an omen of things to come. I was setting up the posts for the deck foundation, carefully measuring and leveling each one. She marched across her perfectly manicured lawn, a clipboard clutched in her hand like a weapon. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp and brittle. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced. I'm Carol, president of the Neighborhood Beautification Committee." I wiped a sweaty hand on my jeans and extended it. "David, nice to meet you. We moved in last month." She ignored my hand, her eyes scanning the construction site in my backyard with undisguised disapproval. "Right, the new occupants. I need to see your permit for this structure." I admit, her tone rubbed me the wrong way. It wasn't a neighborly inquiry, it was an interrogation. Still, I kept my voice even. "It's right here, posted on the window, per city code." I pointed to the bright orange permit taped to the inside of our kitchen window, clearly visible. She squinted at it from 20 feet away. "And the noise ordinance? Construction is only permitted from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. on weekdays and 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. on Saturdays." It was 10:30 a.m. "I'm aware," I said, my politeness starting to feel like a heavy coat on a summer day. I helped write half the city's building codes. A flicker of something, confusion, annoyance, crossed her face before she settled back into her default expression of pinched disapproval. "Well, just see that you keep the debris contained. We have very high standards in this neighborhood." She turned on her heel and marched back to her house, the clipboard held stiffly at her side. From then on, it was a Cold War fought across a picket fence. Notes would appear taped to our front door, written in an aggressive, spiky handwriting. One complained that Maya's chalk drawings on our own driveway were an eyesore. Another was about the unpleasant odor of the garlic and onion Sarah was cooking. The most ridiculous one was a formal warning that our garden gnome, a cheerful little guy Maya had named Gorman, was not in keeping with the aesthetic harmony of the community. I did my best to ignore it, to focus on my family and my project. The deck was my baby. I designed it myself, every plank, every joint, every screw meticulously planned. I'm a professional, after all. For 25 years, I'd worked in construction and building inspection. I started as a carpenter's apprentice, worked my way through every trade, got every certification under the sun, and for the last 3 years, I'd held the title of chief building inspector for the entire city. I knew the code backwards and forwards because I was the one who signed off on it. My deck wasn't just going to be beautiful. It was going to be the most structurally sound, over-engineered, and perfectly compliant deck in the entire state. The harassment escalated. One day, a car from the city's code enforcement department pulled up. A young inspector I'd trained myself, a kid named Tim, got out looking incredibly uncomfortable. "Hey, Chief," he mumbled, avoiding my eyes. We got a anonymous complaint about unpermitted construction and, unsafe work conditions." I gestured around my meticulously organized work site. Every tool was in its place, safety guards engaged. Debris was neatly piled on a tarp for disposal. "Look around, Tim. Does anything here look unsafe or unpermitted to you?" He flushed with embarrassment. "No, sir, of course not. It's perfect. It's just, we have to follow up on every complaint. You know the drill." He scribbled a few notes on his pad, officially clearing me of any wrongdoing, and practically sprinted back to his car. I watched him go, then looked over at Carol's house. The blinds in her living room window twitched. That should have been the end of it. She'd tried the HOA angle, she'd tried the code enforcement angle, and she'd failed. I foolishly thought she might finally give up, but I had severely underestimated the depths of her malice. The next Saturday was the day it all came crashing down. I was using a pneumatic nail gun to attach the decking boards. It's a loud tool, I'll grant you that. It makes a sharp, percussive thwack that can be startling if you're not expecting it. But it was well within the hours allowed by the noise ordinance. I was in the zone, working quickly and efficiently, the beautiful cedar planks transforming the frame into a real functional space. I didn't even notice the police cars at first. They'd pulled up silently, no sirens, just the flashing red and blue lights painting streaks across my neighbors' houses. The first I knew of their presence was a voice, amplified and authoritative, cutting through the suburban quiet. "Step away from the tool, sir. Put your hands in the air, slowly." My blood ran cold. I froze, the nail gun still in my hand. It suddenly felt impossibly heavy. I looked up and saw Maya's face, small and terrified, pressed against the kitchen window. Sarah was standing behind her, her hand over her mouth. One of the officers, a tall man with a stern face, began to approach me cautiously, his partner staying back by the cars. "Sir, we received a 911 call about a disturbance," he said, his voice tight with adrenaline. "A report of a possible burglary in progress, and a man matching a weapon." A weapon. She'd called the nail gun a weapon. My mind was a maelstrom of fear and fury. I knew the statistics. I'd seen the news stories. A black man, a perceived weapon, a nervous cop, the equation could have a fatal result. Every instinct screamed at me to defend myself, to shout that I lived here, that this was my home. But I clamped down on it. I forced my body to be a statue of compliance. My breath was shallow, my gaze locked on the lead officer. My life in that moment depended entirely on his perception of me. "Sir, I'm the homeowner," I said, my voice unnaturally calm. I was amazed it didn't tremble. "My name is David Miller. I'm building a deck." "The call reported a man breaking in through the back," the officer said, his eyes flicking from me to the half-finished deck to the tools scattered neatly on the tarp. He was processing, but the tension didn't leave his shoulders. "The weapon you were brandishing?" his partner called out. I nodded slowly towards the deck. "That would be my pneumatic nailer. It's for nailing." The absurdity of the statement hung in the air. Just then, the back door slid open. Sarah stepped out, her face pale. "Officers, what's going on? This is my husband. We live here." The lead officer held up a hand to her, a gesture that was meant to be calming, but only heightened the tension. "Ma'am, please stay back for a moment." He turned his attention back to me. "Sir, can I see some identification?" This was the part I dreaded, the part where I had to move. "Yes," I said, speaking every word with deliberate clarity. "It's in my back right pocket, my wallet. I am going to reach for it very, very slowly." He gave a curt nod. My hand moved as if through molasses, my fingers finding the familiar worn leather of my wallet. I pulled it out, held it up between my thumb and forefinger, and carefully tossed it onto the grass in front of me. He watched it land before approaching and picking it up, never taking his eyes off me. He opened it, his partner now moving to cover him.
He thumbed past my credit cards and family photos until he got to my driver's license. His eyes scanned it, then looked up at me. He did a double take. He looked down at the ID again, then back at my face. A slow, creeping change came over his expression. The hard mask of suspicion began to crumble, replaced by confusion and a dawning sense of embarrassment. "You live at this address?" he asked, his tone completely different. "Yes, for about 2 months now." He handed the wallet back to his partner and looked at the house, then at the building permit still taped to the window. He finally seemed to be seeing the whole picture. The family home, the kids' toys on the lawn, the clearly permitted construction project. The burglar with a weapon narrative was evaporating before his eyes. He peed his radio. "Dispatch, be advised, the situation appears to be a misunderstanding. Homeowner is on site, no signs of a break-in." He looked at me, a deep flush coloring his neck. "Mr. Miller, I apologize for the aggressive approach. The nature of the call required it." And that's when I saw her, Carol, standing on her porch, her arms crossed, a sickeningly smug look on her face as she watched the drama she had created unfold. The puzzle pieces didn't just click into place, they fused together with white-hot rage. The complaints, the code enforcement call, and now this. This wasn't about noise or aesthetics. This was about something much uglier. "The nature of the call?" I asked, my voice now low and hard, the forced calm replaced by a cold fire. "Let me guess, the call came from her, didn't it?" I jerked my chin towards Carol's house. The officer had the decency to look uncomfortable. "The caller reported anonymously, sir." "Bull," I said, taking a step forward. "That woman has been harassing my family since the day we moved in. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate, malicious act. She could have gotten me killed." My voice carried across the lawns. I saw Carol's smug expression falter, replaced by a flicker of indignation. She took a step forward, as if to defend herself. "I was concerned," she called out, her voice high and reedy. "I saw a strange man in the backyard with some sort of gun. I was protecting the neighborhood." The officers exchanged a look. It was the look of two people who dealt with this kind of thing all the time. The lead officer sighed and walked towards the property line. "Ma'am, this man is the homeowner. That gun was a construction tool. Filing a false police report is a serious offense." "It wasn't false," she insisted, her voice growing shrill. "How was I supposed to know? He doesn't look like he belongs here." The words hung in the air, naked and ugly. The officer's back stiffened. I felt Sarah's hand on my arm, her grip tight. I looked at my daughter's face, still pressed to the glass, her eyes wide with a confusion that would soon curdle into a painful understanding of the world. The officer spent another 10 minutes talking to Carol, his tone becoming increasingly stern. I could hear snippets about wasting police resources and the legal ramifications of her actions. She grew more defensive, more flustered, but not once did she sound apologetic. Finally, the officers came back over to me. "Mr. Miller, again, I apologize. We will be filing a report about the call. You have the option to press charges for filing a false report." "Oh, I'll be doing more than that," I said, my mind already working, the gears of 25 years of navigating bureaucracy and code books beginning to turn. The fury was still there, a hot coal in my stomach, but it was being shaped and sharpened into something else, something focused. They left, and the street returned to its placid Saturday quiet, but everything was different. The flashing lights were gone, but I could still see them seared onto the back of my eyelids. I went inside and hugged Maya, who was trembling. I held Sarah, who was trying to be strong, but whose eyes were filled with a mixture of rage and fear. My home, my sanctuary, had been violated. My safety had been threatened in the place I was supposed to be safest.
That evening, after I'd tucked a still rattled Maya into bed, I sat in my home office, the blueprints for the deck spread out before me. But I wasn't looking at them. I was staring at my computer screen. Carol wanted to talk about rules. She wanted to talk about what was and was not permitted in her neighborhood. She thought she could use the system as her personal weapon against me. She had no idea who she was dealing with. With a few clicks, I logged into the city's records mainframe. I had top-level clearance. I could see every permit, every inspection, every survey, every complaint for every single property within city limits dating back 50 years. I typed in her address, 124 Oakwood Lane. Her file popped up. It was thin, mostly tax records and utility easements. She lived there for 30 years, a model citizen on paper. But I kept digging, cross-referencing old plot maps with current satellite imagery. I pulled up the original building permit from 1988 when the house was built. Then I pulled up the certificate of occupancy. And then I saw it. A tiny discrepancy. An annotation from a long-retired inspector about a last-minute change to the property line for drainage purposes. Something that small, something that old would be forgotten by anyone. But it was there, in the records. I zoomed in on the satellite view, tracing the property lines with a digital tool. Then I overlaid the original survey from the city archives. My heart started to beat a little faster. It wasn't just a discrepancy, it was a violation. A small one, almost insignificant, but it was a thread. And I knew that if I pulled on that thread, her perfectly curated, beautified world would start to unravel. Carol wanted to play by the rules? Fine, we'd play by the rules, all of them, starting with the unpermitted, non-compliant, and illegally placed fence she had just finished installing last summer along the back of her property, the one she'd bragged about at the last HOA meeting, the one that, according to the city's official survey, was built 18 inches onto my land. The next morning, the birds were singing and the sun was shining, just like the day before. But the air in my backyard felt different. It was charged, electric. I didn't pick up my nail gun. Instead, armed with a mug of coffee, my professional-grade measuring wheel, a can of fluorescent orange spray paint, and the printed-out official survey map from the city archives, I walked to the back of my property. I could feel Carol's eyes on me from her kitchen window. Let her watch. I started at the known survey marker on the corner of my lot, a small iron pin buried just below the grass. I calibrated my wheel, then began to walk the property line, exactly as detailed on the city plat. 10 feet, 20, 50. I moved with a deliberate, unhurried pace. As I approached the pristine white vinyl fence that separated our yards, the numbers on my wheel ticked closer and closer to the official boundary. I didn't stop at the fence. I kept walking. The wheel rolled over her perfectly manicured lawn, through her prize-winning petunias. 1 foot, then 18 inches. I stopped. I took out the can of bright orange spray paint, shook it vigorously, and drew a crisp, unapologetic line right through her flower bed. Then I turned and walked the line all the way down the length of our adjoining properties, a fluorescent scar across her lawn, exactly 18 inches on her side of her fence. I hadn't even finished my coffee before her front door slammed open. She stormed across the lawn, her face a mask of purple fury, a cordless phone clutched in her hand. "What do you think you're doing?" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at the orange line. "You are vandalizing my property. I'm calling the police again." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. "Go right ahead, Carol," I said, my voice calm and even. "I'm sure they'd be very interested to see this." I held up the official survey map. "This is a city document, a legal record of our property lines. And according to this document, your fence, not to mention your award-winning petunias, are encroaching on my property by 1.5 feet. Her face went from purple to a blotchy pale white. She snatched the paper from my hand, her eyes scanning it frantically. She knew what it was. She knew I was right. The developer had shifted the line slightly decades ago for drainage, and every homeowner since had just assumed the old fence line was the correct one. But assumptions don't hold up against official city records. This is a mistake," she sputtered, but the conviction was gone from her voice. "It's no mistake," I said, taking the map back.
But this is, I pointed at the fence. That is an unpermitted structure built across a property line without a variance or an easement. It's a code violation, a pretty serious one actually, the kind of thing that has to be removed immediately. The fight seemed to drain out of her. She stared at the fence, then at the orange line, then at me. For the first time, I saw not just anger in her eyes, but a sliver of fear. I had turned her own weapon, the rule book, against her, and she was utterly unprepared. She didn't call the police. She retreated back into her house, and for the rest of the day there was an uneery silence from next door. The blinds were drawn tight. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. I went back to work on my deck, the sound of my nail gun now feeling like a declaration of my right to be here, to build my life in my own home. The next morning, a Monday, I woke up early. I put on my best suit, the one I saved for city council meetings. I clipped my official city inspector badge to the pocket. When I arrived at the municipal building, I didn't go to my spacious office on the top floor. Instead, I went down to the public permitting counter, the same counter where any citizen would have to go. I took a number and waited my turn. When my number was called, a young clerk named Brenda looked up. "Oh, good morning, Chief. You don't have to wait in line. You can just—" I held up a hand. "Today, Brenda, I'm not the chief. I'm just a citizen, a homeowner. I'm here to file a formal complaint." I laid everything out on the counter. The survey maps, the photos of the encroaching fence, a copy of the police report from Saturday. I filled out the official 7-page complaint form in triplicate, detailing every violation with the precise code section and subsection. Unpermitted structure, property line encroachment, failure to obtain a variance. I was thorough. I was meticulous. I was relentless. I created a file so thick and so perfectly documented that it couldn't be ignored. The system I managed was now being aimed like a cannon at my next-door neighbor.
The complaint was assigned by the book to a senior field inspector named George, a stickler for the rules, a guy who had no patience for people who thought they were above the law. I knew he would handle it by the letter. 2 days later, on Wednesday, I was working from home when I saw George's official city vehicle pull up in front of Carol's house. He got out, clipboard in hand, and marched up to her front door. I watched the entire exchange from my office window. I saw him show her the complaint. I saw her face twist in disbelief. I saw her arguing, waving her arms. I saw George, implacable and stoic, simply point to the fence, then to the orange line on her lawn, which was still vividly, aggressively there. He handed her a piece of paper, and I knew exactly what it was: a stop work order and a notice of violation. The notice would give her 30 days. 30 days to either bring the structure into compliance, which would be impossible without getting a variance from me, her neighbor, or to remove it entirely. If she failed to comply, the fines would start. First, $100 a day, then $500. Then the city could place a lien on her property. I thought that would be the end of it. I had won. I had used the system she weaponized against me to corner her completely. I had proven that I belonged here, not just by right, but by a mastery of the very rules she held so dear. But that evening, I got a call on my private cell phone. The number was blocked. "Is this David Miller?" a man's voice asked. It was smooth, professional, and had an undercurrent of steel. "Who's asking?" "My name is Arthur Vance. I'm the attorney representing Carol Peterson." My stomach tightened. Of course she had a lawyer. "Mr. Miller," he continued, his tone dangerously pleasant, "my client feels she is the victim of a targeted harassment campaign and a gross abuse of power on your part. Using your position as chief inspector to intimidate a private citizen is a very serious allegation. The kind of thing the mayor's office and the local news stations would find very, very interesting." He let the threat hang in the air. This was no longer about offense. She was escalating. She was coming after my job, my career, my reputation.
Your client called the police and reported a black man with a gun in my own backyard, I said, my voice ice cold. She endangered my life. This started with her, and I am simply following city protocol. And we have a dozen sworn affidavits from neighbors who will attest to your loud, disruptive construction, your aggressive behavior, and your general disregard for the community standards, he said smoothly, a clear fabrication. It paints a very different picture. A picture of a man who doesn't fit in, who uses his official power to bully those who question him. Now, we can make all of this go away very simply. You retract your complaint, you approve a variance for the fence, and my client will graciously agree not to pursue a civil rights lawsuit or file an ethics complaint with the city. He was offering me a deal, but it felt like a guillotine. He was twisting my legitimate defense into an act of aggression. He was banking on the fact that a public fight, no matter how right I was, would tarnish my name. A black man in a position of power accused of bullying a poor, elderly white woman? I knew how that would play out on the 11 o'clock news. You have 24 hours to decide, Mr. Miller, Vance said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Think about your family. Think about your career. Make the smart choice. Then he hung up. The phone felt slick in my hand. I stood there in the quiet of my home, the scent of cedar from my unfinished deck wafting through the window. He was right. A public fight would be messy, ugly. It would drag my family through the mud. They could paint me as the villain, and enough people would believe it. All I had to do was back down, let her win, and my life could go back to normal. But as I looked out the window at the orange line I had painted, a line that represented my right to exist peacefully in my own home, a different kind of anger began to burn within me. It wasn't hot and fast anymore. It was cold, slow, and utterly resolute. She thought she had me cornered. Her lawyer thought he had me intimidated. They still had no idea who they were messing with. They had come after my home. Now they were coming after my career. They had left me with no other choice. It was time to stop playing defense. It was time to go on the attack. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my office, the lawyer's threat echoing in my mind. He thought he had checkmated me. He saw a career bureaucrat, a man who would fold to protect his pension and his quiet life. He and Carol had fundamentally misjudged me. They saw a black man who had gotten a little too high up, and they assumed his position was fragile, easily toppled by the right accusations. They didn't understand that to get to where I was, I had to be twice as good, twice as tough, and 10 times more meticulous than anyone else. I had built my entire career on the unshakable foundation of the code. The code was my shield and, when necessary, my sword. The next morning, I didn't call her lawyer. I called mine. Then I made another call to a man named Bob Jenkins. Bob was a legend in the city, the chief surveyor for 40 years before he retired. He'd personally mapped half the subdivisions built since the 70s. More importantly, he hated bullies and people who tried to game the system. I told him the story. He just chuckled. "Give me 24 hours," he said. While Bob did his work, I went back into the city archives. I wasn't looking at Carol's file anymore. I was looking at the whole neighborhood. I cross-referenced every permit, every variance, every easement granted in our subdivision for the last 30 years. I created a spreadsheet, a web of interconnected data points. A pattern began to emerge. Minor variants granted here and there. Small fence line disputes settled informally. It was the normal ebb and flow of a community. But one name kept popping up as the primary complainant or the driving force behind many of the HOA's stricter rulings. Carol Peterson. Her name was attached to a complaint that forced the Garcias to repaint their front door from a cheerful red to a community-approved beige. She was the one who blocked the Patels from building a small backyard prayer shrine, citing zoning restrictions on auxiliary structures. She had led the charge to deny a wheelchair ramp for the elderly Mr. Henderson, arguing it would ruin the curb appeal, forcing him to use his garage as his main entrance. Each incident on its own was a petty neighborhood squabble. But taken together, woven into the timeline of who was moving in and who was being targeted, the pattern was undeniable. It wasn't about beautification. It was about control. It was about who she felt belonged. The next afternoon, Bob called me back. "You're not going to believe this," he said, and I could hear the glee in his voice. "Your neighbor isn't just encroaching on your property. She's encroaching on the city's."
My heart skipped a beat. What are you talking about? Remember that drainage easement from the original plat? The one that caused the property line shift in the first place? He said. Well, that easement runs along the back of all those properties. The developer deeded a 10-foot wide strip to the city to ensure access for storm drain maintenance. Her fence isn't just 18 inches on your lawn. The back corner of her prized rose garden, the one with the little cherub statue, is sitting smack in the middle of a public utility easement. It's an illegal obstruction of public right-of-way. This changed everything. This was no longer a civil dispute between two neighbors. This was a citizen in violation of municipal law. The complaint I had filed was about to get a major amendment. That evening, I got another call from her lawyer, Arthur Vance. His voice had lost its smug, confident edge. It was replaced by a strained, almost panicked tone. "Mr. Miller," he said, skipping the pleasantries, "my client has received another notice, an official cease and desist from the city legal department, regarding a public easement. What is this?" "That," I said, my voice as calm and steady as a concrete foundation, "is called due diligence. Your client built on land that doesn't belong to her. Land that belongs to the public, land that I, as a city official, have a sworn duty to protect." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear him shuffling papers. He knew he was beaten. A fight with a neighbor is one thing. A fight with the full weight of the city's legal and public works departments is another. "What do you want?" he finally asked, his voice a ghost of what it had been. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, laying out my terms. "Your client will issue a full written apology to my family for the harassment and for filing the false police report. She will dismantle the entire fence, not just the part on my property, all of it, at her own expense within 14 days. She will remove all plantings and structures from the public utility easement. She will resign as president of the Neighborhood Beautification Committee effective immediately, and she will never, ever contact my family or file a complaint against us for any reason ever again." "That's outrageous," he sputtered. "It's non-negotiable," I replied. "The alternative is that I let this play out. The city will remove the fence and the garden and bill her for the cost. The daily fines for the code violations will continue to accrue. And I will personally submit a full report to the district attorney's office regarding her filing of a false police report with clear racial bias, which I believe elevates it to a hate crime. We can also have a very public conversation about the ethics complaint you threatened me with. I have a feeling the press would be very interested to learn about a lawyer trying to intimidate a public official to cover up his client's illegal activities. How does that sound?" He was silent for another 30 seconds. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head as he calculated the cost of his client's prejudice. I'll have to discuss this with my client," he stammered. "You have until noon tomorrow." I hung up the phone. The next morning, an email arrived from Vance. Attached was a scanned letter signed by Carol. It was a stilted, formal apology, but it met my terms. It acknowledged the false report and expressed regret for the distress it caused my family. By the end of the week, a work crew appeared in Carol's backyard.
They spent 2 days dismantling the white vinyl fence piece by piece. They dug up her prize-winning petunias and her precious rose bushes. The little cherub statue disappeared. An ugly trench of bare earth was all that remained where her beautification projects had been. I never saw her again. A for sale sign appeared on her lawn a month later. The neighborhood felt lighter, the air cleaner. The Garcias painted their door red again. Mr. Henderson's son built him a beautiful, sturdy wheelchair ramp up to his front porch, and I made sure his permit was approved in record time. That Saturday, I finally finished my deck. It was beautiful, strong, solid, and perfectly up to code. As the sun set, Sarah, Maya, and I sat on our new deck furniture. Sarah raised her glass of iced tea. "To the chief inspector," she said, her eyes shining with pride and love. Maya, who was now old enough to understand a little more of what had happened, snuggled up next to me. "You beat the mean lady, Daddy," she said. I looked out over my backyard, at the space where the fence used to be, a space now open and free. I had built more than a deck. I had defended my home. I had protected my family. I hadn't used anger or threats. I had simply used the truth, meticulously documented and relentlessly applied. She thought the rules were her weapon, but she never understood that I wasn't just following the rules. I was the rules. And in my neighborhood, in my city, the rules are for everyone.